Good morning. It is Thursday, April 25th, and this is The Drill. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the one of only two true conservatives in the United States of America today, because we're the only ones that make the presumption for the status quo, and that other person is, of course, President Donald J. Trump. Speaking to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and was listening again this morning to, I did listen to some of what is his name now? Well, Glenn Beck for sure, but he's the second program that I listen to. When I get up, I'm listening to Hugh Hewitt, and he had a guest host on this morning. And both of them were doing some analysis of various topics. The topic du jour seems to be Joe Biden's announcement that he is going to go ahead and run for president of the United States. Surprised me because it seems to me that Mr. Biden has no fire in the belly. He doesn't really seem to be somebody that really wants it, so to speak. But I don't know. We'll see. I want to get out of the habit of making predictions. The left has gone ahead and brainwashed this country into and gotten us into the habit of making predictions rather than making judgments and analyzing from a standpoint of not from a judgmental standpoint, but from a neutrality standpoint. And that's what was going on this morning with regards to Joe Biden. Joe Biden made some speech with basically in which he's saying he's going to rescue the United States from turning into Nazi Germany, and that's what's happening under President Trump. And of course, the statement is arbitrary. And instead of anybody analyzing and noting that this particular statement is arbitrary, and also noting that passing a judgment, and one of the judgments that you can pass on this particular statement, besides the fact that it is arbitrary, is the fact that it is impolitic. It will be unpopular. It is a speech that is not going to unify people, but is going to have a tendency to divide them. Those people that, like Donald Trump, are going to despise the speech, and those that have a tendency not to are going to love it. So he's appealing apparently strictly to his base, which I suppose is appropriate because what he's looking for is the nomination of the Democrat Party. But it would seem to me that the first things that he would be doing then would be to talk about and express how he is in lockstep with the values, whatever they happen to be, of the Democrat Party. But in any case, both Hugh Hewitt's substitute and I think it was Mark Belling, and Glenn Beck both analyze this from the standpoint of neutrality, which is what the left has encouraged everybody to do. When you're watching television shows, news programs, or whatever, rarely is their judgment passed. You'll hear shows, particularly news shows, that will brag. They'll say, well, we'll bring you the news, you decide. Well, no, that's BS. You're going to bring me a tornado, an earthquake, and then I'm going to decide whether or not there was devastation or that what happened behind this devastation was bad. No, that's ridiculous. You need to pass judgment. We all need to judge. There's a bumper sticker that says, vote as though your rights depend on it. And I say, judge as though your rights depend on it. Judge as though the republic depends on it. Judge as though your very life depends on it. And that's what they needed to do this morning when they're looking at Joe Biden, and in terms of his candidacy, there's not much to judge there because we're not Democrats, and so this is going to, it's going to be basically up to the Democrats to decide. But there is things to judge about his speech, his announcement, the idea that we're turning into Nazi Germany. There's plenty to judge there, and that's what they should have done and not only just for their own sake, but for the sake of their audience, to remind their audience that judgment is an inescapable part of life. You have to exercise judgment all day, every day, from the time you get up in the morning until the time you go to bed at night. Now, one of the things that you may ask is, okay, on what basis do I make judgments? And I have a book by Joseph Piper called The Four Cardinal Virtues: fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence. So again, for Joe Biden's speech, the first thing is it prudent? Was the speech prudent? Was it just? Was his assessment of what Donald Trump allegedly said or meant during a particular speech just? Did he exercise temperance, or was he being extreme in the way he was expressing himself? And then also, did he exemplify fortitude? But I'd like to go ahead and read from the preface of this book that will explain a little bit more about these four virtues. When Agathon in Plato's Symposium takes his turn at making a speech in praise of love, he organizes his ideas around the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. An avant-garde intellectual who, incidentally, is the host at that famous banquet, Agathon offers no special reasons for this approach. That is, the contemporaries of Socrates already took for granted these traditional categories sprung from the earliest speculative thinking. They took for granted not only the idea of virtue, which signifies human rightness, but also the attempt to define it in that fourfold spectrum. This particular intellectual framework, the formula which is called, quote, the doctrine of virtue, unquote, was one of the great discoveries in the history of man's self-understanding, and it has continued to be a part and parcel of the European mind. It has become a basic component of the European consciousness as the result of centuries of persistent intellectual endeavor by all the creative elements of the emerging West. Both the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and the Romans, Cicero and Seneca, both Judaism, Philo, and Christianity, Clement of Alexandria and St. Augustine. It is true that the classic origins of the doctrine of virtue later made Christian critics suspicious of it. They warily regarded it as too philosophical and not scriptural enough. Thus, they preferred to talk about commandments and duties rather than about virtues. To define the obligations of man is certainly a legitimate, even estimable, and no doubt necessary undertaking. With a doctrine of commandments or duties, however, there's always the danger of arbitrarily drawing up a list of requirements and losing sight of the human person who ought to do this or that. The doctrine of virtue, on the other hand, has things to say about this human person. It speaks both of the kind of being which is his when he enters the world as a consequence of his createdness, and the kind of being he ought to strive toward and attain to by being prudent, just, brave, and temperate. The doctrine of virtue, that is one of form of the doctrine of obligation, but one by nature free of regimentation and restriction. On the contrary, its aim is to clear a trail, to open a way. But this is not the place to launch a disputation on the various possible modes of ethical statement. Rather, what I wish to do is to describe just one of those modes and to reveal, as far as possible, its full reach. That team of four, the basic virtues, which is, as a fine classical phrase put it, can enable man to attain the furthest potentialities of his nature. In this realm, originality of thought and diction is of small importance, should in fact be distrusted. It can hardly be expected that there will be entirely new insights on such a subject. We may well turn to the wisdom of the ancients in our human quest to understand reality, for that wisdom contains a truly inexhaustible contemporaneity. The intention of this book is to reveal some of that contemporaneity. Some readers may wonder why, in my effort to revive a classical heritage, I so often cite a certain medieval writer, Thomas Aquinas. I do so not from a more or less accidental historical interest, but because I believe that the testimony of this universal teacher of a still undivided Western Christianity has special value. This lies not so much in his personal genius as in the truly creative selflessness which he expressed the vast, contrapuntal range of possible sentiments statements about the cosmos. Even as he recognized and called upon his readers to go beyond the limitations of his own vision, marked, though this thought is, by altogether extraordinary grasp and the most disciplined, dynamic, and penetrating independent thinking, there yet speaks through it less the individual writer, Thomas Aquinas, than the voice of the great tradition of human wisdom itself. The interpreter in these latter days invokes this tradition in the hope of seeming less ridiculous, as he boldly drafts a moral standard for humanity which he, in his own daily life, is utterly unable to meet. Now, the last part of this is a rather dangerous statement to make in the face of the politics in which we find ourselves, because one of the reasons that the left has nothing to say about ethics, about right and wrong, is because they claim that ethics is a standard to which no one can truly aspire, because no one can attain it. No one can be good enough. And so therefore, ethics is ridiculous in and of itself, and so we shouldn't ever talk about it. What we should do instead is just simply describe events and the psychological, emotional, or other consequences those events have on our lives, rather than passing a particular judgment. I'm assuming that when he says unable to attain it, I assume that what he's meaning is that he's unable to perfect it. In other words, he is not perfectly temperate, not perfectly just, not perfectly, not perfectly, doesn't have perfect fortitude, and not perfect prudence. So I assume that's what he means, is that the perfection, not the fact that he can't attain it. In other words, that he doesn't have even a little bit of any of these qualities. So, but it is important to know also that virtue, ethics is another way of putting it, but virtue is real and it matters. It is something that we need to be able to acknowledge ourselves and to be able to talk about. The left will tell you all the time, you'll hear it from your coworkers, I've heard it from mine, don't judge. Don't listen to that. Don't listen to that. Judge, 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 judge. And my response to people that say don't judge is always the same. Why not? You're judging me. So until next time, we've come to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill, and until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.